those on the special concerns list, and those in the military. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Dr. Marzouk. Looking forward to your 3 Sundays with us. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
It's wonderful being with you. And I love the name of the class, Covenant. Very Presbyterian of you. And it's also a way of building a faith community that continues to be rooted in a deep relationship with God and also with one another. So it's wonderful being with you this morning and to do a Bible study series with you on migration in the Bible and the life of the church. Our topic for today is on the integration of Joseph in Pharaoh's court. There is one main point that I hope we remember out of this Bible study, but then I will unpack it as we look at this very important chapter of the book of Genesis. The main point is what happens if we reverse what we usually assume, that the host community is the one responsible for offering hospitality, and the host community becomes vulnerable to express its need for those who are deemed outsiders. And what happens when outsiders, or those who are deemed migrants, vulnerable, asylum seekers, refugees, are ones that see themselves as those who can make a contribution to the world that will welcome them. We usually assume that hospitality is our job as a host community, and the migrant is only recipients of our generosity. What happens if we are vulnerable as well, and we have the courage to say that we need those who are deemed outsiders and deemed vulnerable? What shift happens when migrants and asylum seekers and refugees and those who have been forced to leave everything that is familiar to them, they see themselves as agents, as actors, as someones that God can use in order to transform the communities in which they will live? So in order to make this point, I would like for us to look at chapter 41 in the book of Genesis. Just an overview of the Joseph story, or the Joseph narrative. The Joseph story is a long novella or short story in the Bible that is found in Genesis chapter 37. And then we skip chapter 38, it talks about Judah and Tamar. And then it picks up again the story of Joseph in Egypt from chapters 39 to chapter 50. It's a story in which there is conflict between Joseph and his brothers that ends up in his betrayal and him being sold, forced into migration into Egypt. He thrives in Potiphar's house, but this integration is so fragile because once Joseph is accused of something as a migrant, as a Hebrew, as a marginalized person, does not get justice, so he's thrown into prison. In prison, this dreamer becomes an interpreter of dreams. He interprets dreams for 2 of Pharaoh's officers. One of them, Joseph asks that person to remember, the cupbearer, to remember him once he goes back to his job in Pharaoh's court. And the story progresses where Pharaoh himself has 2 dreams. And none of the Egyptian wise people can give meaning to this dream. And all of a sudden, this cupbearer remembers this Hebrew marginalized, imprisoned person who can interpret dreams. And he tells Pharaoh. Joseph comes, he interprets the dream. Pharaoh appoints him as a second person in command, and he saves Egypt and Canaan from the famine. And then Pharaoh welcomes Joseph's family, Jacob, and 70 people. The story ends with Jacob and Joseph dying in Egypt and them being embalmed or mummified as a way of kind of having 2 kind of funerals for these 2 important figures in the biblical narrative, Joseph and Jacob. They are in some ways integrated into the Egyptian culture in one way, but then they are buried back in Canaan, or their bones, like Joseph, would be taken with the people who leave Israel. Egypt is portrayed in this narrative in a way that is different than the Egypt portrayed in the book of Exodus. Egypt is a place of refuge. Egypt is a place that gives place for this Hebrew community to thrive and to survive a famine. So in this story, the story of Joseph, scholars have wondered, how did this story came to be this beautiful, full-blown narrative that talks about conflict, reconciliation, migration, and integration, and the thriving of the Hebrew community in Egypt. If you're familiar with a theory about the composition of the Torah or the Pentateuch or the 5 books that we usually attribute to Moses, from the 19th century, scholars have wondered whether these books are actually a composition that is made up of different sources. That sources or narratives that begin either with creation or God's covenant with Abraham, and then it goes to the ancestral narratives, and then it goes into the Exodus, and then the giving of the commandments, and it ends with the people at the borders of the promised land. So different sources or different aspects or different narratives that are intertwined. At some point, scholars started to also look at the Joseph story as a coherent story, as a story that the duplications in it, like 2 dreams or who sold Joseph into Egypt, or all of these other repetitions, as literary style, rather than being made up of 2 different sources or 2 different documents or 2 different traditions intertwined. Scholars look at the Joseph story as a unified narrative, a story that was written for a particular purpose as a whole. And one of those purposes, some scholars wondered, Egypt is portrayed positively. So where else in the Bible do we see Egypt portrayed positively? During the time of Solomon. Solomon had a diplomatic relationship with Pharaoh and married Pharaoh's daughter. So possibly maybe the story was written during the Solomonic era, where there is a positive image of Egypt. But that's not the only time Egypt is portrayed positively. So scholars start to wonder, maybe for another purpose for the story of Joseph. Some scholars suggested that the story of Joseph was written in order to explain why the Israelites were in Egypt, so that they would leave Egypt in the Exodus. Some sort of a bridge between the stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the stories of Moses and the Israelites who left Egypt. But that's kind of a really long bridge, 14 chapters, if not more, right? So scholars looked at the content of the narrative and came to the conclusion that the story, since it's concerned about a foreigner, a Hebrew person who is forced to migrate to Egypt, live in Egypt, and rise in Pharaoh's court, and thrive in this foreign country, that the story might have been written as a diaspora story, as a story that is written in order to meet the needs of the community of the Israelites or the Judahites who were forced to migrate at the time of the exile. You remember in the 722, the Assyrians came and conquered the northern kingdom Israel and forced the inhabitants of the northern kingdom to live in different places, and they pushed them and forced them to live in different parts of the ancient Near East. And then in 587, the Babylonians came and conquered Jerusalem and caused many people from Judah also to either be forced migrants in Babylon, and some of them also went down to Egypt. So some scholars believe that the story of Joseph as a whole was written in order to address the community that was forced to migrate, that was exiled, that they were confronted with this forced migration and its questions. Is it faithful to seek refuge in a place that is away from the promised land? Is it faithful to go to Egypt to seek a new possibility and a new way of being, even if that means leaving the promised land, because the promised land is under this Babylonian hegemony or this under the imperial power? When you look at the Joseph story, this starts to make sense. The story does have a lot of interest on how Hebrew migrants relate to the culture that surrounds them. So you look, for example, at Joseph's integration in Potiphar's house. The story begins by saying that it's not just the migrant who goes down to Egypt, it's Yahweh. Yahweh was with Egypt. Yahweh was with Joseph in Egypt. And this to us sounds like, yeah, God is everywhere. So what's the big deal here? If we go back to the biblical worldview where God would mostly dwell either in the temple or the promised land, and the text surprises its readers and its audience saying God was with the forced migrant. God was in Egypt, in this foreign land, accompanying this person who was forced to migrate. And then Joseph gets integrated, but then he gets betrayed. He faces injustice. And as a migrant, he does not get a hearing. He does not get justice. Then you have an exchange of blessing between Jacob and Pharaoh. You have also this burial customs that I talked about earlier. So in all, the story seems to try to explore with the faith community that was forced to migrate on how to live a faithful life outside of the land. How to deal with the religious other, those who are different from you religiously. How to deal with those who are different from you in terms of their culture, in terms of the way they eat, the way they dress. The story is concerned with those who are forced to migrate and to live outside what's familiar. So, as I mentioned, the story develops where the dreamer, Joseph, who had two dreams, he dreamt of power. He dreamt that his siblings and possibly his parents, according to Jacob's interpretation of Joseph's second dream, would do respect to him or even bow before him. And his father rebuked him, and his brothers envied him, and his brothers were actually very angry with him to the point that they thought about killing him, and then they sold him to the Ishmaelites or the Midianites, depending on the tradition that we read at the end of chapter 37. So Joseph is a dreamer. Once he is in Egypt, he becomes an interpreter of dreams. It reminds us of Daniel, which is also a diaspora story, a story that is also told about Israelite figure like Daniel, who is also living outside the land, and he becomes an interpreter of dreams to the Babylonian king. There seems to be something about the experience of migration, being in this liminal space, living between cultures, that has to do with being the ability to interpret dreams. Yes?
Remind me of the definition of the diaspora.
Yeah, the diaspora is a community that was. Oh, the question is, what does diaspora refer to? So diaspora refers to a community that was forced to migrate, and they live away from their homeland, but then they have still connection to the homeland. But they are forced migrant, and they form a distinct identity in the land or the community that hosted them.
But the second one was, what, 70 AD, right?
70?
70 AD.
Yeah, but that's way later where,
I know that,
yes.
But so there was several diaspora.
Yes, exactly. So when the Romans destroyed the temple, it also forced many Jews to leave the land and also live in diaspora. But that started way earlier, and this is the time where the Joseph story would have been written, 587 BCE or so. So Joseph, who was a dreamer in his family's household, now becomes an interpreter of dreams in the place where he was forced to migrate. He interprets the dreams in prison, but then he expresses his need as a migrant who is imprisoned unjustly in Egypt. He tells the cupbearer in chapter 40, verse 14, "But remember me when it is well with you. Please do me the kindness to make mention of me to Pharaoh, and so get me out of this place. So Joseph knows that he was imprisoned unjustly, and now he has interpreted the dream. He has done a favor to the cupbearer of Pharaoh, and Pharaoh is going to reinstall this cupbearer, take him out of prison and put him back in his position. So Joseph tells him, remember me when you are before Pharaoh. Then the story kind of like moves forward, and Pharaoh dreams 2 dreams, and none of the Egyptian royal court members is able to interpret it. And then all of a sudden the cupbearer remembers this Hebrew slave who is able to interpret his dream, and he tells Pharaoh, and Pharaoh brings him out and tells him the dream. And twice Pharaoh repeats this phrase in verse 15 and verse 24. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I have had a dream, and there is no one who can interpret it. This is a ruler of a strong, powerful nation that is expressing his vulnerability and his need to this imprisoned Hebrew slave. So in order to think about integration, and in order to think about our responsibility and our ways of engaging migrants in our midst, Pharaoh's character, as portrayed in the narrative, is offering a different model for what it means to be a host community. This is a powerful ruler who expresses his vulnerability and his need, his perplexity, his confusion to this imprisoned refuge and asylum seeker and migrant. But it's not only about expressing the mutual need for the other that happens between Joseph and Pharaoh. They both see each other as spiritual beings. And by that, I mean they both see each other as a channel through which God reveals God's will for the world. So Pharaoh has these dreams, and Joseph offers interpretation to these dreams that there will be a famine. And in order to face this famine, there will be 7 years of plenty, and therefore we should store food in order to meet the needs of the 7 years of famine. But there are lots of details between the telling of the dream and the interpretation of the dream that show us something of a shift of how to see those who are around us, who are different from us culturally, ethnically, and even religiously. Listen to these words, for example, when Joseph hears the dream from Pharaoh. In chapter 41, verse 25, Joseph, a Hebrew, says to Pharaoh, who is an Egyptian, God has revealed to Pharaoh what God is about to do. And once Pharaoh hears the interpretation, and it pleases Pharaoh because it makes sense to him, in a way, offering a plan to meet the famine and the crisis that Egypt will face, listen to the words of Pharaoh that he says to his court. Pharaoh said to his servants, can we find anyone else like this, one in whom is the Spirit of God? Again, this is an Egyptian powerful ruler who looks at the migrant Joseph, who just offered an interpretation of his dream, and seeing him not only as an economic asset, not only as someone who is going to make a great contribution to the Egyptian economy, he sees him as a spiritual being, as someone who is empowered by the Spirit of God. So Joseph is a Hebrew. He sees Pharaoh, the Egyptian, who is different ethnically and religiously from him, as a channel through whom God reveals God's will. And Pharaoh, the Egyptian, the powerful ruler, sees Joseph the migrant as someone who is empowered by the Spirit of God in order to give meaning and give wisdom on how to face this pending crisis that is going to take place. So the other is seen as a channel through whom God reveals God's plan for the world. The text uses the word Elohim. This is a generic word for God. So when Joseph says, God revealed to Pharaoh, and when Pharaoh says, the Spirit of God is in him, they don't identify which God. In the whole story of Joseph, chapters 37 and 39 to 50, the name Yahweh is only used in chapter 39. But in the rest of the story, the narrative uses the word Elohim, which is the generic word for God. In other words, we don't know which God they were referring to, both Joseph and Pharaoh, when they were saying, God revealed to Pharaoh, or the Spirit of God. We don't know. Possibly the Egyptian God, possibly the Hebrew God, possibly the divine in general. Possibly here we have a Hebrew and an Egyptian who are coming together, finding a common ground upon which they both stand and see each other as an instrument that God uses in order to save Egypt and Canaan and the faith community that is coming, Jacob's family, from this famine. So here we see people who are different religiously and ethnically. Once they have the vulnerability and the courage to express their need for the other, once they see the other as someone who can actually make a contribution, once they see the other as a spiritual being, not just an economic asset, they start to find a common ground that helps them to cross differences, to work together despite the differences. They face the famine and they deal with the famine, and they offer generosity and hospitality, not only for the Egyptians, but also for the Canaanites. Here, Joseph the dreamer, who dreamt in Canaan and that forced him to be a forced migrant, ended up in Egypt, gave meaning to the dreams of the host community. And chapter 41 tells us that the dreams of those who are seeking a better life are intertwined with those who see themselves as a host community. So Joseph is integrated in Pharaoh's court. Pharaoh is pleased with the interpretation. He sees him as an agent through whom God reveals God's will. Then Pharaoh gives him Egyptian clothing, gives him an Egyptian name, gives him his signet seal, gives him an Egyptian wife, daughter of the priest. So here we have even an interreligious marriage happening. The question that I want us to think about, does Pharaoh impose the Egyptian culture on Joseph? Does Pharaoh use his power to make this Hebrew assimilate into the Egyptian culture? Or does Pharaoh use his power and his privilege in order to make room for the Hebrew migrant to be empowered to be the second person in command? The text does not give us an answer to this question. It just tells us what Pharaoh did. And it's open to interpretation. Did Pharaoh impose the Egyptian culture on Joseph, the migrant, to assimilate him into the Egyptian setting? Or can this be read as an empowerment? Because maybe people in the Egyptian court would actually resist that and tell Pharaoh, what are you doing? You're bringing the foreigner and giving them all this power. They might do this and they might do that. And Pharaoh is actually using his power in order to protect and help this foreigner integrate into the Egyptian culture. Did Joseph abandon his Hebrew culture? When his brothers came in chapter 42, they did not recognize him. And he was speaking Egyptian to them. They needed an interpreter. Did he assimilate completely that even his brothers did not recognize him? What about the fact that he named his children Hebrew names? This is open here for an interpretation with regard to the dynamics of integration. How do we think about the interaction between Pharaoh and Joseph when it comes to integration? Is it assimilation or is it integration where Joseph still maintains some of his Hebrew identity? He did not completely abandon his culture. So in conclusion, so that we open it up for discussion, the overarching question that I think we need to be considering as we think about migration in the Bible and in the life of the church is to wonder, what difference does it make to reclaim the reading of the Bible as a text that was written by many communities that faced migration, that faced exile, and they had to live and navigate relationships with many communities that are different from them. Many of the stories that we read in the Bible are stories about communities of faith that were forced to live in other cultures than theirs. Even when they were going to the promised land, they were leaving a culture behind and they were going to interact with another culture ahead of them. When they were forced into exile, they had a memory of their home culture, and now they were living in Egypt and in Babylon and in other parts where they needed to learn how to navigate their faith relationships in relation to the cultures that they are going to live among. What have we lost when we started reading the biblical traditions from and through a lens of settled communities, communities that have lived in one place for generations? And we forgot that most of the biblical narratives were narratives written by and for communities that were in diaspora and were on the move. What can we reclaim as we start to read these texts with and as migrants? I'm also hoping that once we start to do that, we start to reconsider the assumption about who's offering hospitality and who's making contribution to whom. And instead of just seeing one community offering hospitality and offering generosity, and another community is the only recipient of that hospitality and generosity, what difference would it make if we see this relationship as a mutual, codependent relationship in which communities who see themselves as hosts, communities who see themselves as migrants, have a need for the other and also have something to offer to the other? What difference does it make to those who have been forced to migrate, who have been deprived of their home culture and their resources, who have been dehumanized to live in refugee camps, and that have taken away from them this idea, this belief that they are agents, that they can make a contribution to the communities that will host them, that they themselves now would see themselves in a new light, like Joseph claiming his agency as someone through whom God would save Egypt and God would save Canaan as well from the pending famine. It's a way of just seeing the other in a different way. And when we do that, we also see ourselves in a different way. We muster the courage to express our vulnerability and our need for those who are different from us ethnically, religiously, and culturally. And we also muster our courage to offer hospitality and generosity, realizing that when we do that, we are also receiving. We are also being enriched. We are also being hosted by those whom we have called guests. I would like to open it up if you have any comments or feedback or questions. Yes.
What was Egypt's religion, and was Pharaoh considered a god, or were there lots of multi-gods?
Yeah, so there were, Egypt was polytheistic, so there were multiple gods. Pharaoh would have some sort of a divine aspect as the son of the god, but Egyptians would not be worshiping Pharaoh, for example. They would be worshiping the Egyptian deities. But this story here is quite fascinating because for the most part, we hear a misrepresentation of Egyptian religion in some ways, but also condemnation of the religious other, right? The Exodus story, for example, is a combat between Yahweh and the gods of the Egyptians. But in this story here, in the Joseph story, we do not have this sense of competition. We do not have this, portrayal of our God is the true God and your God is the false God, or the other way around. We have two people who are different religiously and ethnically, who are seeing each other as spiritual beings. So Pharaoh here is not, condemned as someone who is trying to divinize himself or put himself in opposition to Yahweh, as we read in the book of Exodus. Pharaoh here is a benevolent leader, ruler, who is in some ways empowering this migrant. When, if you read chapter 45 and chapter 47, he gives the Israelites the best of the land. He allows them to work and to live in Goshen and other parts like that. So there is that layer and aspect that we find in the Joseph story that does not seek to demonize Egypt or Pharaoh, as we might see in other parts of the Hebrew Bible, which raises a question for us. So if you put side by side the Pharaoh of the Joseph story and the Pharaoh of the Exodus story, which power are we going to embrace and endorse? Power that integrates or power that oppresses, right? So even putting these stories side by side is raising an important question for the readers.
I've got something in the chat. I thought I would just say it into the microphone so you don't have to repeat it.
Okay.
Could the relationship with migrants be considered in light of Jesus' advice to render to Caesar, i.e. migrants assimilate into the politica, migrants assimilate into the political, legal realm, but keep their culture?
Yeah, I mean, there is the question about the legal aspect about migration that is really important to think about and to consider. But a law needs to be just as well. Any legal aspect need to take into consideration justice. So a law is not a law unless it's also seeking to do justice, especially for the vulnerable ones. So the matter is not about using a legal aspect in order to deter those who are vulnerable, those who are facing crises in their home country without looking at their humanity. So when we use the word legal and the law of migration, we need to be asking, are these laws, are these legal aspects also doing justice to those who are oppressed, those who are facing violence, those who are facing civil wars, those who are facing the crushing, grinding powers of imperial economy that sometimes powerful nations participate in. So we need to think about those legal aspects, because Caesar was actually an imperial system, and Jesus resisted that. So Jesus was not accepting the Roman imperial rule. Christianity was actually about resisting the rules of the empire that is motivated to crush and control those who are powerless. So it's really important to also read Jesus' statement both on its own term, because Jesus was not actually just complying with the empire. Jesus was saying, well, give to Caesar what Caesar wants. But then, to whom is your first allegiance? Is it to Caesar or is it to God? And the broader message and witness of Jesus is that the kingdom of God takes precedence over human powers and human kingdoms, which is centered on love that is self-giving to the others. So we proclaim Jesus as Savior, but also as Lord, not Caesar. Jesus is our Lord, who calls us to show generosity and kindness to those who are in need. Yes.
A huge percentage of Nobel laureates are of the Jewish faith. Go back in history, 500, 600 BC, did that wisdom in that culture precede when Joseph went to Pharaoh, and Pharaoh said, he comes from a smart group, I need to listen to him?
Well, we don't know about the worldview that the story was assuming, because again, the Exodus narrative might also have been written later. So there could be memories of Asiatics, some slaves who come from West Asia, who might have been imprisoned in Egypt and then left at some point. But I don't think this is what the story of Joseph is really assuming or building on, because even with the memory of the Exodus, it would be an antagonistic relationship. I think if we want to read the Joseph story in relation to another portrayal of Egypt that is really significant, is the book of Jeremiah. So in Jeremiah 42 to 44, Jeremiah tells those who are living in the land, do not go down to Egypt, because if you go down to Egypt, you will find famine. If you go down to Egypt, you are going to face crisis. If you go down to Egypt, you will be plagued. The Joseph story, I think, was actually offering a different argument. The Joseph story was saying to those who were seeking a better life, you will find a better life in diaspora. You will find a better life in Egypt. And it's really important to think about that the way we think about boundaries, the way we think about state boundaries, that was not the case in the Bible. They didn't have our contemporary worldview about state boundaries and state geographies. People were able to move more freely than what we do in our contemporary world. Yes.
Was the Pharaoh of the time of famine dream interpretation the same individual as the Exodus? And if so, is there any indication of what would change that sense of synergy that saved Egypt from famine to wanting to keep the Israelites?
Yeah. So the question is whether Pharaoh of the Joseph story is the same Pharaoh of the Exodus story. It's not. And in the way the narrative is structured, actually, the book of Exodus begins with the Pharaoh who knew Joseph died. And then a new Pharaoh came to power, a new king came to power over Egypt. And the new king started to actually oppress the Israelites, seeing them as a threat because they were multiplying and growing. So it's a different one. But sit side by side, they are asking us, how are we going to use our power? Yes.
I confess that a lot of these stories I read for their historical value and was pushing ahead because I wanted to get to the next book,
Yes.
the New Testament, and really focus. And I've never had such insight as you had, and it's exciting the interpretation you have of the intent of these writers, or the potential intent of the writers, and it's most interesting.
I wonder with the amount of time that you've spent studying this, if you also picked up any indications of the historical validity of this story, because the Egyptians were making records in stone, because I think at that time, a lot of the world was making their historical records on clay tablets or papyrus that could not last as well. Did you validate the historical efficacy of this story as well? Or is it just an allegorical story?
Yes, thank you for the question. So the question is about the historicity of the narrative, and whether there is a way to validate or substantiate a figure like Joseph rising to power in Egypt, right? Is that the question?
Someone with that much power in Egypt had something carved somewhere.
Yes, and unfortunately, we don't have a like an Egyptian record of someone like Joseph rising to power. I think the story is like the story of Esther, like the story of Daniel. These are stories that are written in order to empower the diaspora communities, the communities that were forced to migrate in order to navigate the relationships. It's still true to me. Truth here is not based on whether it happened or not. It's not about factuality. It still says truth in the sense that the God who's portrayed in the Bible is a migrant God, is a God who even goes to exile with those who were forced to migrate. It's a God who is faithful to God's people, and through God's people, God blesses the world. So I find in the Joseph story actually a fulfillment of God's promises to Abraham. In your descendants, all the nations shall bless themselves. And in this case here, Egypt, by empowering this Hebrew migrant, was blessed in this sense because it was saved. So I usually try to distinguish between historicity and factuality on the one side and whether it's truthful or not. I read it as a truthful narrative, a truthful story, witnessing to the God of the Bible, who is a faithful God to the faith community, even when they are in exile, even when they are forced to migrate and to be oppressed. Yes.
We've got about 3 minutes left.
Okay.
The biggest problem that I've experienced over time, interpretation of what's God's will. A lot of our
Yes.
Islamic students have just let go of the controls and said, well, it's God's will. I'm going to survive, and try to convince them that no, keep your hands on the control, try to go through what we instructed you and survive that situation. That was always a difficult situation as to how to kind of say, okay, is it God's will that I live or God's will that I die? And train.
Yes.
That was a very difficult course for us to try to manage.
Yeah. So the question is about divine sovereignty and human agency. I think the story of Joseph is actually engaging this very question. Joseph, for example, once he is in Potiphar's house, he does his best. He doesn't say, well, I was betrayed, I was sold into slavery, I am just going to give up. He did his best and he thrived. He was thrown into prison. He didn't give up. He did his best also in prison. Same thing when he was going to meet Pharaoh. He probably knew the culture. So how do you go meet this powerful man here? So he shaved and he changed his clothing and he went. So there is a deep integration of divine sovereignty, God's will, but also humans who are also taking things in their hand, doing their best. So the way I would think about that is we are, as human agents, are called to do everything that we can to make this world a better world for everyone, but then we also realize our limitations. And this is where God's will and God's power comes in to bring, what we can't complete into completion.
We've got a question in the chat.
What
And
about the
2 minutes
time?
left. You want
Oh.
to save it till next week or you want to take it?
Depends on all of you. I'm happy.
All
to-
right, okay. It's a
Yeah.
heavy one, so hang in. I welcome your challenge that we view the bilateral exchange of gifts between 2 or more cultural groups, host and immigrants/refugees, et cetera. You have used the term codependency to describe this flourishing. Codependency has a negative connotation, and I wonder how you think of using symbiosis to describe this exchange rather than codependency. Does the term symbiosis convey a change on both sides that may enhance each?
Well, that's a new term to me, symbiosis. I will look it up.
The definition thereof may be beyond what his focus.
Yeah, but
The biological.
Well, it's the dependency between them benefits both, I think. is-
yes, or also that when we encounter the other, we are also transformed. So we don't remain the same. That's so. But here for now, like when you have a sense of emergency, you have a crisis that is coming, right? You have a pending famine, and you have 2 people who are different, and they are both offering. They are depending on what the other can offer in order to face this crisis. But I don't think that we remain the same once we encounter people who are different from us, if we encounter them in a genuine way, if we are open to being transformed. And that's actually the topic of next week, when we look at the story of Cornelius and Peter. So we're,
Stay tuned
yes.
for episode 2.
Okay. Thank you,
Thank you
Dr.
all
Marzouk. We'll see
for your engagement.
Dr. Marzouk next week. Just want y'all to know that like Joseph, I'm an interpreter of dreams as well. And I know everybody's been dreaming about getting back to normal as soon as possible. And I'm pleased to report that the church is gradually getting back to normal. No masking, and we actually have coffee in the room now. And I know that all you UNC and Duke fans have been dreaming of a win today in the NCAA tournament. So hope that occurs. All right.
Pun intended.
No pun intended. Yeah. See y'all next week. Thanks for joining.
Thank you.